The scream split the Virginia night like the tearing of the earth itself. Witnesses said it didn't sound human, not entirely, more like something born of the slaughterhouse and the graveyard at once. It came from Peetton Grove, a plantation so vast it was whispered that even the river bent its path to avoid its soil. By morning, 13 members of the Peetton family would be found not merely dead, but carved open, arranged in ways that defied reason. The records describing that night were locked away for over a century, buried not out of shame, but out of fear. Because what happened there didn't just defy morality, it defied explanation. And at the center of it all was one man, a slave named Isaac. He didn't just vanish after the massacre. He left behind a calling card so disturbing that even hardened sheriffs swore never to speak of it. They called him the Butcher. But the deeper you dig, the more it becomes clear. Isaac was not simply a man who snapped. He was something else entirely, something that forces us to ask, what happens when the oppressed carve open the oppressor, and what hidden forces shape the blade? To understand Isaac, you must first understand the world that made him. Cumberland County, Virginia, in 1847 was not merely fields of tobacco and genteel dinners. It was a theater of control, a stage where power was enforced not only with chains and whips, but with psychology. Every slave knew their role was to bow, to obey, to keep their spirit caged. And yet, Isaac was different. Witnesses said he carried silence like a weapon. His grey, near-colorless eyes unsettled even seasoned overseers. He worked in the slaughterhouse, where his knife moved like an extension of his will, no wasted cuts, no hesitation, no mercy. Animals were transformed under his hand with surgical exactness, and yet, it was his restraint that terrified people most. Blood never stained him. His clothes, even after hours of carving, remained spotless. Rumors grew. Some whispered he had made pacts with shadows. Others said his knowledge of anatomy was too precise to be self-taught. And behind closed doors, the Peetton family boasted of acquiring him at a bargain price, mocking Crawford, his previous owner, for selling a problem slave. But what Crawford never told them was this: Isaac didn't simply butcher animals, he studied them, and he was waiting. The Peetton family thought they owned Isaac. They thought his silence meant submission, his labor meant loyalty. But what they never understood was that Isaac was watching, studying not only the livestock, but the family itself. He knew when Cornelius left his study. He knew when Margaret arranged her flowers. He knew the exact hour the children were sent to lessons, when the grandmother rocked in her chair, when the sister kneaded bread. He memorized the rhythm of their days like a hunter memorizes the movement of prey. And what unsettled the few slaves who spoke of him later was this: Isaac never asked for freedom, never begged, never cursed his condition. He simply observed. Some said he kept notebooks no one ever found, sketching anatomy, recording times, measuring with his pale eyes. By 1847 he had mastered the plantation's clock better than the master himself. The Peettons believed Isaac's value was in his skill with the blade. They couldn't see the deeper truth. The blade was only the surface. Beneath it was intention, a precise, patient, mathematical will. And when that will finally moved, it wouldn't be an explosion of rage. It would be a performance. March 15th, 1847 began as any other day at Peetton Grove. The fields hummed with labor, tobacco seedlings pressed into the earth, and Margaret Peetton fussed over the spring garden. The children recited their lessons under the watchful eye of their tutor. Cornelius counted his profits, dreaming of another year of prosperity. No one noticed the silence creeping in from the quarters. No one noticed that the usual chatter of slaves had faded, that the fires were cold, that Isaac's cabin door stood ajar. It was Jonathan, the physician brother, who saw it first. The stains across the threshold, dark and metallic, too deliberate to be accident. When he pushed open Isaac's door, he stumbled into a nightmare. The room was immaculate, yet suspended from the beams were shapes he first mistook for livestock. Only when his eyes adjusted did he understand. Limbs, torsos, organs, human, prepared with precision, hanging like cuts of meat. There was no frenzy here, no chaos. It was method, ritual, A calculated rearrangement of flesh and bone. Jonathan fled, only to find the main house just as quiet. Doors ajar, food untouched, needles mid-thread. And upstairs, the Peettons, posed like mannequins in tableaus of death. Cornelius sat in his leather chair, ledger open, head severed and placed upon the desk as though it were still studying the numbers. Margaret, frozen in a parody of domestic peace, her decapitated head nestled among the flowers she had been arranging. The children in their nursery, seated in a circle, their bodies playing at a game they would never finish, their heads gathered in the center, as if in secret council. Prudence, the matriarch, watching the horizon with her head set carefully on the table beside her Bible. And Catherine in the kitchen, bread dough clinging to her lifeless fingers, her head on the cutting board. No blood, no struggle, only order. Each cut identical, each wound precise, each arrangement deliberate. Sheriff Hawthorne would later say, it was as though the killer had not only mastered anatomy, but art. The horror was not in the violence, but in its control. It mocked the idea of accident. It mocked the idea of chaos. Whoever did this wanted to be understood, not as a murderer, but as something higher, something that carved meaning into death. And the missing piece, the shadow unaccounted for, was Isaac. The butcher was gone. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived with deputies and the county coroner at dawn. Hardened men accustomed to violence, but what they saw inside the Peetton house left them pale, trembling, unwilling to speak above a whisper. Every body bore the same single cut, swift, clean, exact, as if the killer had struck from behind with surgical knowledge. There were no defensive wounds, no cries, no signs of panic. It was as if each member of the household had simply allowed themselves to be taken. Stranger still, the bodies were warm. Hours had passed, yet decomposition had not begun. The blood had vanished, drained from the veins as though harvested. The coroner wrote of it once, then never again. He was said to have burned his notes in fear of what they implied. The immediate suspicion fell on Isaac, and on 3 other slaves missing from the quarters. But the search revealed something more chilling. Symbols carved into beams inside Isaac's cabin. Not words, not letters, but geometric patterns, measured angles, spirals, intersecting lines like maps of something unseen. Sheriff Hawthorne demanded they be destroyed, but one deputy swore the lines shifted when you stared too long, as if they were alive. The newspapers of 1847 never told this story. The plantation deaths were erased, folded into whispers, sealed in courthouse vaults, but fragments survived, letters, sheriff's notes, testimonies that slipped through fire. They describe Isaac not just as a runaway, but as something more dangerous, a man who had learned to invert the system of control. For centuries, plantation masters practiced domination as ritual, breaking minds, owning flesh, keeping order through fear. Isaac had studied it, then turned it back upon them. The symbols carved in his cabin were later compared to African cosmograms, diagrams of passage between worlds, gateways of the body and the spirit. Was Isaac merely a butcher, or a priest of some knowledge smuggled in chains, hidden in plain sight beneath slavery's machinery? The arrangement of the bodies wasn't madness. It was message. A reversal of power so absolute it terrified even the victors who later wrote the history books. And so they buried it. But here's the truth they didn't want you to see. Isaac revealed the master's greatest fear, not rebellion, not war, but order turned against them, precision weaponized, knowledge reclaimed. The blade in his hand was not just steel, it was law rewritten. Imagine standing in that silent house, every corpse arranged not as victims, but as pieces on a board. You'd feel it, the hum of intent, the pressure of a mind that understood control more deeply than anyone around him. This is where most men flinch, where they look away and call it evil, madness, unspeakable. But ask yourself, who first carved order into flesh? Who first decided that bodies could be owned, measured, traded like livestock? Isaac only mirrored what had already been done to him. That's the part history refuses to confront. He didn't just kill, he demonstrated. He showed that discipline, the very weapon used to break men, could be reversed, refined, turned into a mirror so sharp it cut both ways. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. He never stopped. The Peetton family were not the end. They were the beginning. From that night onward, Isaac became a name whispered in taverns, a ghost parents used to frighten children, a story so unsettling it collapsed into myth. But myths have roots. Myths are memories we refuse to face. And Isaac's memory is not one of horror. It is a manual, written in blood, about the power of order. They said Isaac fled into the cypress swamps, vanishing into a darkness only the desperate dared enter. Yet sightings followed. A plantation in Mississippi found its overseer dead in his bed, body untouched, head resting on the ledger where he kept the names of the enslaved. In Alabama, a family of merchants was discovered seated upright at their dining table, every face severed clean, every mouth frozen mid-conversation. Always the same precision, always the same mocking silence. Word spread faster than chains could silence it. Among the enslaved, his name became a password, a whisper of hope wrapped in terror. Isaac had mastered the master's blade. Among the planters, his legend festered like rot. They said he could walk without sound, that his cuts were cleaner than any surgeon's, that he carried knowledge older than America itself. Some swore he wasn't killing at all, that he was harvesting something, taking not lives, but essences, extracting what the masters thought they owned, the soul of dominion. The missing blood was proof. It was never about feeding, it was about erasing. To encounter Isaac was not to die, it was to have your entire claim on power unstitched. And men feared that worse than death. By 1850, Isaac's story no longer belonged to one region. It bled across the South like a fever. Some whispered he had been taken in by maroon colonies hidden deep in the swamps, where escaped slaves lived beyond the reach of white law. Others claimed he'd been seen in New Orleans, walking calmly into backroom gatherings of men in black coats, men who themselves claimed to rule the hidden order of the New World. Isaac's legend began to bend, to twist into something greater than a man with a blade. Planters spoke of him as if he were a curse, a spirit summoned whenever their power wavered. Among the enslaved, his name traveled along secret paths, carried in songs, coded in prayers. Isaac was no longer flesh. He was initiation. The forbidden lesson, that order could be seized, inverted, rewritten. Secret societies feared him because he mirrored them. He carved symbols, kept rituals, arranged bodies like sacred geometry. He was their reflection, but without allegiance to wealth or empire. Isaac served only the lesson, that mastery is fragile, that the whip can be broken. And in every retelling, one question lingered. Was Isaac still a man, or had he crossed into something unbound by death itself? As the Civil War ignited, Isaac's name returned like smoke through broken walls. Union scouts wrote in field journals of arriving at burned plantations where bodies were left in familiar order, seated, arranged, heads severed, silence absolute. Confederate officers, desperate to preserve morale, forbade mention of him, but rumors bled into the ranks, a shadow stalking battlefields, striking not for one side, but against the idea of mastery itself. One colonel swore his supply officers vanished overnight, later found in a barn, posed as if still conducting inventory, their ledgers soaked with bloodless ink. Soldiers whispered that Isaac had grown beyond knives, that his hands alone held separate flesh from bone, that he was not killing indiscriminately but choosing, erasing men whose power came from the ownership of others. And yet, there were stranger reports. Freedmen in Union camps sang songs with verses invoking Isaac as protector, guardian, executioner of tyrants. To them, he wasn't horror. He was proof that even the most controlled order could shatter. To the masters, he was nightmare incarnate. And as the war tore America apart, both sides feared the same thing, that Isaac was not merely alive, but unkillable, feeding on the collapse of empire itself. When the war ended, the nation rewrote its story. History books spoke of freedom, emancipation, reconstruction, But Isaac's name was struck out, buried beneath silence. And yet, hidden files tell another tale. Union officers filed reports of Southern judges found dead in chambers, seated upright, their heads placed on the gavel block. Freedmen's schools burned overnight, not by mobs, but by a precision fire, with teachers missing, their bodies later discovered in the same ritual order. These reports were sealed, marked as folk violence, erased from archives, but fragments survived in private letters, in testimonies whispered by veterans too shaken to publish their accounts. Some swore Isaac had no age, that when they saw him in 1866, he was the same man who fled Peetton's plantation in 1847, unchanged, untouched by time. Others said he had apprentices, men and women who carried on his geometry of death, replicating his message like scripture. What unsettled authorities most was not the killings themselves, it was the discipline. No frenzy, no chaos, only symmetry. It implied planning. It implied an order higher than the law itself. And in a nation desperate to rebuild, Isaac became the one truth they could never afford to acknowledge, a shadow system rewriting history in blood. By the 1870s, Isaac was no longer just a fugitive etched into plantation memory. He had become doctrine. In the swamps of Louisiana, travelers told of shrines made from bones, arranged in spirals that matched the symbols once carved into his cabin walls. In Georgia, a preacher was arrested after weaving Isaac's name into scripture, teaching that the blade of order was God's true judgment. Even in northern cities, freedmen carried coded charms, claiming they would protect them by invoking Isaac's discipline. The authorities dismissed it as superstition, yet quietly, the killings continued. Families of former slaveholders were discovered dead in their parlors, their bodies posed with mathematical precision. Some whispered Isaac no longer acted alone, that a network existed, a brotherhood, or perhaps something darker, keeping his ritual alive, ensuring the lesson would never die. And then came the most disturbing rumor of all, that Isaac himself had vanished, not by capture, not by death, but by passage. That his symbols were not just geometry, but instructions, a way to step beyond flesh, to cross into the unseen, to become order itself. Isaac the Butcher was no longer feared as a man. He was feared as the proof that control could transcend mortality. The deeper you look, the harder it is to separate Isaac the man from Isaac the Shadow. By the late 19th century, secret societies across America, Masons, Oddfellows, clandestine lodges, began whispering his name in closed rooms. Some treated him as a warning, a specter of what happens when order slips out of control. Others, more quietly, studied his methods. Surviving lodge minutes describe diagrams nearly identical to those carved in Isaac's cabin, spirals, intersecting lines, grids of power. Was he their enemy or their hidden teacher? No one dared say aloud. Yet, his geometry seeped into American psychology. The obsession with control, the fear of rebellion, the unspoken knowledge that discipline itself could be inverted. Even penitentiaries built after the war echoed his logic, cells aligned in circles, overseers watching from the center, as if channeling his symmetrical eye. And while the killings faded from newspapers, stories lingered in margins. A banker in New York, found headless at his desk, body seated as though still working. A senator in Washington, discovered in a parlor, arranged beside his own campaign speeches. Officials called them coincidences. Survivors called them reminders. And Isaac's name, buried but breathing, became not a man's legacy, but America's quiet inheritance. By the turn of the 20th century, Isaac had vanished from textbooks, sermons, and public record. Yet, in the undercurrents of America, his ghost refused to rest. Folklorists in the South recorded fragments of songs, low, rhythmic chants invoking the hand that measures and the knife without blood. Detectives in Chicago whispered about a string of killings too precise to belong to ordinary crime. Entire families, seated, arranged, drained, with no sign of struggle, Always the same geometry, always the silence. By then, Isaac had become less a man and more a cipher, a figure invoked by radicals, whispered about in secret meetings, feared by those who recognized the pattern. Some said the federal government tracked the killings but buried the files, labeling them ritual violence, never daring to print the true name. Others claimed Isaac had simply passed into another body, another century, another mask, carrying forward the same discipline of order through flesh. His myth became a kind of underground scripture, proof that power can be stolen back, proof that systems of control are never absolute. And for those who rule in shadows, Isaac's lesson remains intolerable because it whispers that the masters themselves can be mastered. Today, Isaac the Butcher is absent from school books, absent from history lessons, yet his shadow lingers. Look closely at the world of power and control, the boardrooms, the secret societies, the invisible hands shaping nations, and you see his lesson alive. Precision. Discipline, geometry of dominance. The order once wielded by masters is always vulnerable to inversion. Somewhere, perhaps in the forgotten corners of America, perhaps in minds no one suspects, Isaac's method persists. The blade may have vanished, but the principle remains. And here's the truth no historian will whisper. Every system, every hierarchy, every empire is only as safe as the obedience it demands. Fail to notice the rhythms, fail to measure the angles, and Isaac's legacy finds you. If you understand what I've shown you, write it in the comments twice. Order is power. Let it mark you. Let it settle into your awareness, because recognition is survival. History is not only written by the victors, it is tested by those who remember the lesson in the bloodline of the unseen. Isaac is not gone. He waits, and the moment you think control is absolute, the butcher's truth cuts deeper than any knife ever could.